Good afternoon, everyone. If I can perhaps ask you to take a seat, keep the chatter for the drinks this afternoon, if I can. Thank you, everyone. As a parent of 4 children, I wish my children behaved as compliant as everyone did today. So good afternoon and welcome everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Matt Cavell. I'm the Acting Deputy Secretary for the Agricultural Trade Group in the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. To give you a little bit of what I do on a day-to-day, I oversee the department's export arrangements. So we regulate $1.7 billion worth of product a week, $276 million of product a day. By the end of this session, we would have done probably about $40 million worth of product out of the country. We also regulate things like steel into Indonesia, cosmetics into China. So we as an ag trade group, we are generally interested in trade. We also do things such as traceability. We're trying to reform digital systems and those type of other things, manage our international footprint. So it's a very, very interesting conversation for someone like me this afternoon. And it's always an absolute pleasure to be here at ABARES Outlooks Conference, and this year is no exception. And the first part of today's session is really something that I've sort of witnessed from a side probably for 4, 5, maybe 6 years, Andy, which is catalysing Australia's biosecurity system. So we're going to have a brief overview of what this new system looks like. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who understands the value of biosecurity as a national asset to us as a country. Not only does it help protect our agricultural interests, it also helps protect our environment and our way of life. So it's a very, very important part of what we do. Before we kick off, I would less like to remind people to turn your phones onto silent, which as I just check mine to make sure I've done what I've asked people to do. And also remind you that you can use hashtag ABARESOutlook for what I still call Twitter, but everyone else calls X nowadays. And we'll take questions at the end of the presentations, but before I introduce our first speaker, I would just like to acknowledge traditional owners of the land in which we meet here today, and for us here in Canberra, it is the Ngunnawal people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders with us today. So, to kick us off is Bronwyn Jaggers. Bronwyn is the first Assistant Secretary of DAS Biosecurity Strategy and Reform Division. In her role, Bronwyn is leading the implementation of the National Biosecurity Strategy, which is the first biosecurity strategy for Australia, or first national biosecurity strategy for my state and territory colleagues who've had one for a little bit longer. She also is leading the development of the Sustainable Biosecurity Funding Package announced in the 2023 budget. But more importantly, and why it's worth listening to Bronwyn today, it's her division that leads our department's involvement in the Catalysing Australia's Biosecurity CAB. It's an initiative that's ensuring strong alignment between the National Biosecurity Strategy and leading edge science. So it's my pleasure to invite Bronwyn up to the stage to share with us her division's work on this important initiative. So, Bronwyn?
Thanks, Matt. I think Andy and I were going to stay seated here, if that's all right with you.
Right.
Thanks. It's wonderful to be here today. And as Matt said, for all of us working in the agriculture sector, we're all really well aware of the importance of biosecurity. The cost of managing existing pests and diseases in Australia is in the billions of dollars per year, and of course we're all sharply aware of the potential cost for a new incursion of a pest and disease into Australia, and much of our collective efforts are towards preventing that from happening. So as the Minister announced this morning, we're here today to officially launch, in partnership with our National Science Agency, CSIRO, the Catalysing Australia's Biosecurity Initiative. So we'll be setting off the fireworks in a few minutes at the end of the room. It really has been a long journey to get to this point, so we're appreciative of 10 minutes or so to step you through what it is today, and there'll be a lot more information available on websites and things as well. So I'll kick off and then I'll be handing over to my colleague Andy. Do you want to drive our slides? Thanks so much. So as we're all aware, our biosecurity system is world leading, but our task on biosecurity is becoming increasingly complex. and we've heard a lot about this in other contexts today already. Increases in trade and tourism, changes in climate and land use are causing increases in the number and complexity of biosecurity risks, creating new challenges for governments, industry and other stakeholders. And what we're protecting are multi-billion-dollar industries and our way of life in Australia here, really. So recent outbreaks such as myrtle rust, varroa mite, red imported fire ant and fall armyworm highlight these challenges and the need for us to remain vigilant and continually improve the system. And as I mentioned before, the impact of a new incursion could be devastating. Our colleagues here at ABARES have estimated that for a large multi-state outbreak of foot and mouth disease, it could cost our economy up to $80 billion over 10 years. At the Commonwealth level, the government has invested in a sustainable model for biosecurity funding, as the Minister and our Secretary stepped through, adding an extra $1 billion into the system over the next 4 years and locked in beyond that point. At a national level, we're more joined up than ever with the release of the National Biosecurity Strategy 18 months ago, and its implementation planning is really coming to fruition, and there'll be an action plan published in the coming months. The national strategy draws together and complements the range of strategies that have been developed by the Commonwealth and state and territory governments and the plant and industry and environmental sectors and individual industries. And so it's really great to see all of our stakeholders in the system working together towards our common goal of protecting Australia's producers, our regions and economies and communities from biosecurity threats. The National Biosecurity Strategy recognises the important role that innovation and new technologies will have in continuing to evolve the system. And so against this backdrop, the Catalysing Australia's Biosecurity Initiative is poised to really make significant strides in the way that we invest in R&D and innovation for biosecurity in Australia. And so, as I said, we're here to officially launch the CAB, and we've worked together over many years to get to this point. As you can see there on the screen, its outcome, its goal is to improve long-term national biosecurity outcomes by delivering innovation technologies, digital systems and capabilities. And CAB is really all about partnerships. It's about facilitating new connections through the existing biosecurity R&D and innovation landscape and attracting new investors. And one of our main goals is to provide more sunlight or information about the current R&D and innovation programs that are underway and where the gaps might be. And this will help to direct the already significant investment into projects that can make the most impact in terms of strengthening our biosecurity system. CAB will span from offshore to at the border to on-farm and across prevention through to ongoing management. And now I'll hand over to Andy to take us through a bit more detail.
Thank you. Can I just grab the slides?
Yep.
So thanks, Bronwyn. I'll just introduce those who don't know Dr. Andy Shepherd. He's a very shy, unassuming gentleman, but he is a distinguished scientist. And those who laugh know Andy. He's a distinguished scientist both domestically and internationally around things biological control for weeds. Well, he's done a lot of work focused on weeds, but other species as well. He's also worked tirelessly on this for a number of years, so it's quite a privilege to have someone like Andy, Dr. Shepherd, actually work with this on us. It actually positions us domestically as well as internationally with his standing and the work that Andy does overseas, particularly with the Montpellier Research Centre in Europe. So look forward to your presentation, Andy.
Thank you, Matt. So I'll follow on the presentation. Just one correction. It didn't take 5 years to get CAB. It took 2.5. But
I thought we were talking about it about 5 years ago.
Oh, we probably started talking about it 5 years ago. But anyway, it's been a journey of 2.5 years, and it's really exciting for all of those involved, many of whom are in the room, to be here and us to be able to launch it. So I just want to indicate too that Catalysing Australia's Biosecurity Initiative is also part of the CSIRO missions program. The missions program, as many of you have heard in CSIRO, has been developed to help CSIRO and its partners address Australia's six grand national challenges under the Sustainability Development Goals. And this is very much, this particular mission is focusing on a secure Australian region. But Australia has other missions in the agricultural space, one in drought resilience and another in future protein. So if you haven't heard about the CSIRO missions program, please find more online. And it's been a critical means by which CSIRO is redirecting its investment in the coming years. So through CAB and the external engagement we've done with our partners, we have co-developed some guiding principles that underpin CAB. And I'm just going to read these out. So the first is to drive long-term improvements to the national biosecurity system, clearly using a technology and a digital system development focus, and to attract wide-ranging partners. That's why we're using the word catalyst, catalyzing. It's not about creating something new, it's creating a mechanism whereby we can all come together with our various needs and investments to be able to deliver tractable outcomes by 2030 as we approach the middle of the decade of biosecurity. And we're going to deliver CAB through a number of collectively co-designed outcomes. Areas of impact we think we can achieve by 2030 at scale that will really step change the national biosecurity system. I'd love to tell you be able to tell you what they are. I can't because we haven't defined them yet. That's part of our post-launch activity. But I will get to some projects that are helping us think in the right direction. And so we're following an evidence-based and data-driven approach. So recognising that one of the biggest challenges and shortcomings of the national biosecurity system in Australia is the way we manage, share and analyse data. Huge amounts of biosecurity data exist across the Australian ecosystem in many different forms. But if we can bring that together cohesively to support decision-making, planning, horizon scanning, we'll have a much more effective biosecurity system. So it's around a data-driven approach in its many forms. And deliver technologies and approaches to assist industry and communities. Even though we're both government agencies, it's not about CSIRO helping DAF, it's about CSIRO and DAF helping the Australian community. And that includes all industries, and it includes, as I'll get to later, our Indigenous Australians who play an absolutely vital role in our national biosecurity system. It's also, therefore, to ensure an Indigenous voice is integrated into our outcomes. And we have an Indigenous team working across both agencies to help us achieve that. And just recognising too that the department engages 66 ranger groups across Northern Australia as part of their Northern Australian biosecurity strategy that we help to empower. So there'll be intentional engagement with stakeholders and a co-designed solutions. And I'll come in a minute to the mechanism by which we're going to achieve that. And we'll integrate and evaluate our performance as we go. So instead of just hoping we get there in 2030, we'll be developing mechanisms to demonstrate the value of the collective investments and our achievements through time, to report to our peers. So very early on in the development of CAB, we came to some clear agreement with between the two agencies as to what our priority focal areas would be. And I just want to read through these, just so you get some idea of the scope of what CAB is trying to do. So the first one is better surveillance and detection and advanced surveillance and diagnostics platforms. So we want to focus on developing platform-level technology solutions in the surveillance, detection and diagnostic space to really step forward our surveillance and increase the speed with which we detect new incursions. We want to develop and integrate the modelling platforms that exist that support decision-making around both preparedness and emergency response. There are a number of models in universities and the department and CSIRO that address this in a piecemeal manner, but if we can integrate those, we will be able to provide the best possible information for decision makers, both in terms of preparing themselves for a new incursion, but also in terms of real-time response. Critically important. The third area is around intervention technologies. So we need new technologies to be able to treat and manage the new biosecurity threats and the endemic pests, weeds and diseases we already have. We know that the chemical future is rapidly disappearing, and we need new biological technologies, we need genetic technologies, and in the animal health space, we need things like new vaccines. There is an increasing realisation too that we've built our biosecurity system primarily in Australia around a basis of risk analysis. Risk analysis is what we use to fundamentally drive our decision making. But we can broaden that out. Horizon scanning and intelligence gathering is a critical new way we can collect and process information to understand and improve the way we identify threats and address them. And it learns off a system of cybersecurity that have also adopted intelligence gathering. So it's moving beyond risk analysis to intelligence gathering. It's also around recognising that biosecurity is a human construct, and therefore it's a social challenge around people understanding the value about how they can contribute and how they can have some influence over the way we undertake these activities. So having a very strong social and including economic governance component to what we do. And finally, this performance assurance, making sure that we can demonstrate to all of the agencies involved the value of being a partner in CAB as we go forward. So now the working groups. The working groups are the engine room of CAB, and we've developed these working groups, the ideas of these working groups through our external stakeholder engagement. We had a large external engagement workshop in October, and the working groups will work around problem statements to develop the outcomes that we think we can achieve by 2030 in each of these areas, and then plan what we need to do to get there. So an outcome might be that we can autonomously surveil all of our ports by 2030. We don't need to use divers anymore. If that's our goal, how do we get there? Just an example. And our working groups, therefore, that we've defined around diagnostics, obviously to take into advantage all the cutting-edge diagnostics platforms that are now available, developed both through managing pandemics and supporting the livestock and companion animal industry. Taxonomy is another key working group, recognising that biosecurity is the whole biosecurity policy and legislation is built around the concept of species. And in order to have species, you need to have strong taxonomic support, and integrating that taxonomic support with next generation genome sequencing, which I'll come to in a minute. Data and systems, this is the working group that really will try and address that challenge of how do we integrate our data to support decision making. Intervention technologies, I've already mentioned, a working group specifically around that, which, as I say, will focus primarily on novel vaccines, novel biologicals to replace chemical control solutions, and also genetic control technologies like gene drives that are starting to be developed, including in Australia. We'll have a working group around surveillance, which is really trying to optimise our national surveillance system, particularly supporting our Indigenous Australians that undertake surveillance, and recognising that all of Australians have a role to play in national surveillance, and that general surveillance is our most effective means of picking up incursions early, both in terms of understanding where we should undertake surveillance and supporting surveillance when it happens. And then a very important one, a cross-cutting working group, which I've alluded to, focused on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander engagement. And Torres, who was mentioned in the previous session, is in the room, is part of that working group. We're building that working group across CSIRO and other agencies like NAILSMA to really make sure that when CAB develops these opportunities, it's going to be able to do them in a manner where they are going to meet the needs of our Indigenous Australians, both as players in that national Northern Australia biosecurity frontline, but also as our largest land custodians in Australia and the role they play managing endemic pests and weeds on country. And finally, genomics. We all know the power of modern genomics and the degree to which it will change our lives, but particularly it'll dramatically change our biosecurity system. We've broadly adopted eDNA. We need to move to the next generation of metagenomics and full genome sequencing. So just to finish up, I'll tell you about some of the projects that we've already got up and running through some initiatives we've already developed as we've been preparing for launch. A key one being led by the department is called the Australian Biosecurity Research Database. And that, if you like, is our foundation project. It's the one that allows us to understand where all the research is being funded across Australia and beyond in the biosecurity space through CSIRO, through the governments, through research and development corporations, through all of those agencies, to make sure that we're bringing activities together to be able to develop stuff at scale, but also obviously to make sure that we're making key investments. And that'll underpin the decision-making of the governance of CAB. The second is around developing a biosecurity innovation hub. So as I recognised earlier, we're really trying to develop a biosecurity system and support a biosecurity system of the future, which is not just based on government investment. It's based on creating opportunities for small industries to provide technologies and services for the industry and the community across Australia, and grow that SME ecosystem for biosecurity. And the Innovation Hub basically is being set up to support ideas all the way from invention right the way through to productisation, and providing support and investors all along that journey. And it builds on the department's Biosecurity Innovation Program. Another project, a smaller project we're working on, but is quite topical, is the detection systems for varroamite. And a media release was released for that today. And it's testing a new technology from one of these startups that allows us to detect varroamite on honeybees as they enter the hive. So it's a neat little project that just allows us to get our foot in the door around working with an SME and some technology. Most of what CAB does will not be to fund projects that use technology X to solve Y. We're about investing at the platform level to develop technological systems that will support animal health, plant health, and environmental health. But in some instances, clearly we need to demonstrate the value of these systems. Another project is with the Atlas of Living Australia, who are our big data, if you like, our big data partner in terms of geospatial biological data, and are rapidly including genomics data into their platform. They're developing a biosecurity alert service, which notifies both the Department of Agriculture and the State Departments the moment somebody on iNaturalist picks up something like a red imported fire ant in their backyard instantaneously. So we don't have this delay between detection and adoption, which has been a classic failing of many of these response systems around the world. We have a project that we're working with the Centre for Excellence in Biosecurity Risk Analysis at the University of Melbourne around emergency animal disease preparedness. We know we've got diseases like lumpy skin disease off our borders. How do we best understand where they're likely to arrive? What's the most likely pathway, particularly for a vector-borne disease like lumpy skin disease? Where should we place surveillance? And if it arrives at a particular location, can we understand, by understanding the livestock system and the livestock movements, how it's likely to move around Australia? So that's building on that modelling platform priority area I was talking about. And finally, combating Japanese encephalitis virus. We had this completely unexpected outbreak of JEV last year in southern Australia, and we're starting to understand why that happened. But we know it's endemic, we have to live with it. So we're actually working with US partners, building a project to work with US partners who don't have JEV, to be able to help them work with us to understand how to manage this disease better. Lots of notes. So finally, just what defines, just to be clear, what do we see as being the impacts of CAB if we're successful by 2030? Well, clearly the first one is the primary one is that there's a reduced incidence of emerging threats, that by applying these technologies and systems and getting people to work together at scale, we will reduce the incidence of emerging outbreaks, or if they do occur, we can get on top of them and eradicate them earlier, unlike we were able to do with red imported fire ant. We're also clearly want to support the development of the next suite of next generation biosecurity technologies technology platforms. But we also want to encourage the faster adoption of these platforms. So where they already exist, how do we actually get them from research lab to actually being used on the ground? And the example I always use here is the broad adoption now by governments of environmental DNA as a tool. It was a lab tool 10 years ago, and it took 10 years to get to being used on the front line. If we can just bring that down to 5 years for some of these technologies, we'll have generated a lot of impact. We also want to encourage this private sector for biosecurity, so growing a biosecurity services and technology SME sector by bringing in investors and helping create the value proposition, and ensure that in Australia we're actually creating companies and building jobs through the activities we support. And then finally, as I've already mentioned, empowering our Indigenous biosecurity rangers to be able to build businesses themselves, to be able to work on country. And all I've got to say is we're really looking to all of you who think this is an interesting initiative to get involved. We have a session, the Sundown session, where you can come and talk to us, and we will be reaching out to you to become stakeholders in our initiative. Thank you. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Bronwyn and Andy. Very, very interesting presentation and exciting future for biosecurity technology and for startups. We have 1 minute for a question. If there's a burning question on the floor, there's one on screen. I can't see any on the floor, so we might just go. Will CAB address the social and economic barriers to effective management of established pests, weeds and diseases in addition to the technical solutions you list?
Yeah. So
Over to you.
I would say not directly. As I say, we're really trying to work out how to encourage all the stakeholders to work more effectively together. And I would say the area where we're most likely to focus on that is around data sharing. How do we support better data sharing to support decision making? And in CSIRO, for example, we have a research team that focuses on why do people not share data. So we think we can bring some generic learnings and progress the way we share data across the biosecurity system.
Thanks, Andy. I can't see any hands up in the room as the lights blind me, but perhaps one more. Supporting agriculture to deal with established pests and weeds. Oh, hang on, we're very similar to the last one. We've seen a lot of recent welcome activity in development of biosecurity policy and plans at national and state levels. How is CAB adding to these? Perhaps Bronwyn?
Yeah, so the National Biosecurity Strategy has 6 priority areas for action, and one of them is on research and innovation. I'm trying to remember the exact title, but really that's the focus. So CAB I see as having a direct input into helping to deliver that priority area under the National Biosecurity Strategy. And certainly, as Andy talked about, we're really looking to work throughout the system, including at jurisdictional level and in local communities, giving opportunities for small and medium enterprises as well. So we see benefits across the system, but certainly a direct input into our ability to deliver the goals of the National Biosecurity Strategy.
Yeah.
And all I'll add to that is partnerships is also a key component of the strategy. So we're trying to help that too.
Yeah. Which I think gets to the bottom line, get involved, I think, is where you ended, Andy. We might call it there if that's okay. We do have the next session. Andy did mention Sundowner, so at 5 o'clock you can see Spot the dog dance. Andy promised me he can make Spot dance. So do come
Tony
along.
can.
Do come along at 5 o'clock, just out to the left and up the front there in the courtyard. To talk to Andy and Bronwyn a bit more and answer some, and I can answer some of those questions we didn't get time for. So please join me in thanking Andy and Bronwyn. So as we swap the panel, Spot's leaving for those who are. So thank you. So the remainder of this session is a panel discussion. We're switching to international trade with the theme Changing the Global Conversation on Sustainability, Agricultural Support and Food Security. So I'd just like to start by introducing our panellists from my left to right, your right to left. So first up we have James Fell, who heads up ABARES Trade and Global Change Program. He leads the research on agricultural trade barriers and facilitation, climate and sustainability in food system. His team's work provides evidence-based for international advocacy and development of policies supporting open trade and improved livelihoods, not just for Australia, but more importantly for countries around the world, including our near neighbours. We're also joined by Sue McCluskey, who many of you probably know, who is Australia's first special representative for Australian agriculture. This role has seen Sue promote the agricultural sector under Global Agricultural Leadership Initiative, helping Australia to step up in international engagements. A key part of Sue's success is we now have a number of countries wanting to clone Sue and do their own Sue. And so it's been a really welcome part to our arsenal in international engagement, having someone like Sue working with us. We next have Sarah Hyland. Now, Sarah is the General Manager.
Proceed.
You got it wrong, did I? I apologise. I'm just a simple bureaucrat. So Sarah, and I'll buy her a drink afterwards. Is a general manager of major projects at Grain Growers Limited. She has a wealth of experience in the ag sustainability space. She designed, developed and launched the world's first sheep sustainability framework back in 2021. And last but not least, we welcome Azia Fuzi to our panel. Azia has joined us from Indonesia, and she is a researcher at the Centre for Indonesian Policy Studies, or CHIPS, where they focus on Indonesia's food security and agricultural policies. She's also the co-author for 3 chapters on CHIPS' latest book publication, Modernising Indonesia's Agriculture. So thank you all for joining us today. It's wonderful to have you here, and I look forward to our discussion today. And if it lives up to what Sue's promised, is going to be a very, very fruitful and enjoyable, and perhaps maybe lots of conversation between panel members. So just a bit of scene setting, and so food security and sustainability is very much the focus of global conversations in agriculture. I've been in this role for just over a year, and every bilateral engagement and multilateral engagement I have, everyone wants to talk about how we feed our people and how we do it in a sustainable way. They may call it different things, but it's a very, very consistent message around the world. From an Australian perspective, we are an important player in the global food security market. We export some 70% of our product. We're also a leader on sustainable agriculture, and we're working to make our sector much more sustainable, resilient and climate smart. This also, we believe, helps Australian farmers more productive and profitable. We also think it will help better protect our environment, importantly for what I do, increase access to markets, but also will help strengthen rural communities and contribute to global food security. But this also requires us to reflect a global understanding of what agriculture and how to be more sustainable is, and consider the role it plays in the economy-wide transition to net zero. Trade can play an important role, as does agriculture, but agriculture still remains one of the most trade-distorted sectors in the global economy. So today we're going to explore whether these trade distortions help or hinder agriculture play its role in reaching food security, development and sustainability, and what approaches are effective to help achieve these goals. So before I start and ask the first question, when I talk about support, just to be really, really clear, support can mean lots and lots of different things. It is about tariffs and subsidies. And so the conversation will be, well, what is the right level of support? Where does it go? So James, we're currently sitting around $850 billion of annual global government support to agriculture. Do countries really need it?
Well, Matt, what if I told you the world's on course for $1 trillion of agricultural support per year, sometime soon? Now, most of that is taxpayers and consumers subsidising environmental harm. So we've got to ask ourselves, what's going on here? Now, I reckon there seems to be less interest in trade these days. Perhaps that's, for an Australian audience, because tariffs in our top 10 agricultural export markets are just 6%, courtesy of free trade agreements and the like. But hopefully we get the slides up there sometime soon. We can see there we go. But did you know that, all of this was going on behind borders? So examples of this are price floors in China, an area-based payment for agriculture in the European Union, and that one, it keeps less productive farms in business. Now, most of this, or much of this agricultural support means a whole lot of environmental harm happening. Now, I am a bit nervous because some of my panellists have hinted that they might throw me under the bus here. So I want to just clarify a couple of things. We do, as in ABARES, we do advocate for that top one, R&D, extension, infrastructure. That's generally what people call non-distortionary support. Very rarely associated with any environmental harm. But we'll come back to the mechanisms later for mostly this blue one and this green one as to how that causes a whole lot of environmental harm. So I put it to you that, despite us heading towards $1 trillion, there is hope. The interests of open trade, environmental sustainability, and food security can be aligned. And we can also make progress on another big issue, and that's development. So anything that promotes excessive production promotes unnecessary emissions. So crops create emissions, nitrous oxide. Livestock create emissions. Generally, those distortionary categories of agricultural support, they create unnecessary emissions. But here's the thing, like, we need to eat food. So food means that we need agriculture. So we've got this classic trade-off here. On the one hand, we've got to eat food, but we've got to ask ourselves, how can we make best use of natural resources? Now, there's this third big issue as well, and that's economic development. So we've got to bear in mind that most countries in the world are developing countries. So if we take away ag support, are we taking away livelihoods? So cutting ag support can affect food security, it can affect environmental sustainability and economic development. But what's important when removing ag support is we need to think about what's produced, where it's produced, and how it's produced. On the what's produced, removing subsidies and tariffs means there's less unnecessary agricultural production. On the where it's produced, removing subsidies and tariffs means we end up with countries producing what they're relatively good at and then trading with each other for what they need. On the how it's produced, we end up with the inefficient producers producing less and the more efficient producers like Australia producing more. So as you might imagine, we've done a bit of work on this and we have demonstrated that, in some cases, cutting agricultural support can see this triple improvement. The way this works is that efficient production generally means less input use, and that means less environmental harm. We do see that mirrored in real-world data, particularly for countries like Australia. But if we just go back a bit and we think about the what is produced, that question. So thinking about the what is produced, we end up with this fall in agricultural production. Now that makes quite a lot of sense when you think about it because there's no more excessive agricultural production. Now on food security, we've got to remember that agriculture is an input to food. So even though total world ag production can fall, we can still end up with more food reflecting efficiently produced agriculture and efficiently produced food and production of agricultural goods that the world actually needs, as opposed to ones that governments want producers to make. So then we end up in a situation with food prices lower and we end up with incomes higher. So food security improves, but you ask, why do incomes rise? So it's because we end up with resources being freed up in the economy. They can pursue their most profitable activities without government support. Now that boosts economic growth. Now we might want to have a discussion later, about transition and things like that, particularly in developing countries. You don't want to do this all of a sudden. So Matt, ag support is skyrocketing. I meant to put this slide up before, by the way. But ag support is skyrocketing. I'll just let you have a quick look at that one. So we've got to ask ourselves, how are we going to fix it? Now, it might come as a bit of a surprise. The most prominent solution is through the World Trade Organization. I'll say the much maligned World Trade Organization. I wouldn't give up hope there, because this is this very important fact that perhaps we're not exposed to in Australia, that 80% of the fall in global agricultural tariffs since 1995 has come from outcomes at the World Trade Organization, not free trade agreements. So let's think about the future. And to everyone here, and to you, Matt, and to my fellow panellists, I say it's just so important to reiterate that message that the interests of open trade, food security, environmental sustainability and development can be aligned.
Thanks, James. Very, very interesting setting the context around the synergies between trade, food security, environment and economic development. I must admit, probably the most enthusiastic I've heard from someone for a long time about WTO. So it's good to hear. And the MC13 has just been completed. So, but you're right, we have achieved massive achievements through the WTO arrangements. So Turning to yourself, Sue, from your point of view, what are you hearing about this in global conversations, and how is Australia making its case?
Thanks, Matt. And first of all, I'm not going to throw you under the bus, James, because in actual fact, I was really pleased to hear you say that ag support is skyrocketing, because I'm a farmer and I think the more money we can put into agriculture, the better. But we've actually got to think about the nuancing of this, because there's support and there's subsidies. And there's support and subsidies for developed nations and for developing nations. So let me look at what we're talking about when we talk about subsidies, because I actually, as I said, would like to see us put more money into agriculture, more money to support agriculture, because we operate under changing environmental conditions. We can't control the weather. We can't control economic circumstances. We can't control what happens in global markets. So it's really important. But it's really important as a policy lever that we can get the outcomes that we really want to achieve. So if we look at some of the conversations I have around the world, and, you know, on the surface, and this is what has been perhaps some of the conversations at the WTO, it's pushing back against subsidies. My narrative has changed since I've been in this role about pushing back on subsidies, and I have to say that most countries in the world have no idea that Australia is one of the least subsidised countries in the world. So when I actually say we don't have subsidies, we don't get support, they go, really? I thought everyone did. So that's the first thing we're grappling with. But when I talk to those developed countries, and I talk to them about, such as the US and the EU, about what they can do about their subsidies, I talk about repurposing their subsidies for better environmental outcomes. Because as we've heard from James, as a consequence of this overproduction and not thinking about what are the outcomes you want to achieve, we've actually got perverse consequences that mean we do have environmental degradation. We don't have any sort of emphasis on sustainability, because it's all about produce, and then trash, and just get paid for it. And that is not the way we actually should be operating. It doesn't think about productivity. It doesn't think about the way that we work in Australia's farmers to be economically efficient. But then I think about the developing countries. Now, their motive in terms of the subsidies is really around poverty and hunger and trying to reduce that. So it's actually quite different about what we may do with those countries. But at the same time, I have that same conversation around repurposing. Have you thought about repurposing your subsidies for better health outcomes? So when I've been in countries such as Vietnam or talking to people from India, and I've talked to them about what do the subsidies do? They encourage a high level of pesticide use, a high level of fertiliser use. It's indiscriminate. It doesn't think about what are the consequences on the health of the people. When you actually have that conversation, that starts to resonate, because what they're seeing in these countries is a high cost coming through on the adverse health of their people. So once again, it's saying, how do we actually focus on the outcomes we're trying to achieve from this? Talking to the EU, of course, they would say, but we have repurposed our subsidies. We've got the Green Deal and we've got the Farm to Fork. Well, I just say greenwashing, because they have put in place targets, or they've come up with a solution without thinking what they're trying to achieve, and they can't demonstrate it. And that's where they're coming undone, because they've got a lot of farmer agitation over there because they just can't comply. And I'm going to come back to this in a moment when I talk about regulation. But really, we've actually got to think about how that's an opportunity for Australia to actually be able to get our act together around being able to clearly demonstrate our sustainability credentials and be able to make sure we can substantiate what we're actually saying. Then I look at what we do in Australia around support, and our farmers are supported. You can look at the matching dollar for the R&D model. You can look at some of the provisions in the tax system. But what they're trying to do is be policy levers that can focus on research and development and about efficiency. And it's really around the R&D that we actually can do a lot. And so repurposing subsidies, whether they're in developed countries or developing countries, around research and development, to be able to show them how you can actually be able to farm successfully, productively and profitably without the need for payments to just trash what you're doing is actually something that Australia provides a fine example of. And we have examples of what Australia does, not just through our R&D model and through the RDC model, but also what we do through examples through the aid programs such as ACR, in being able to have research programs, capacity building in developing countries to actually demonstrate that quite clearly. Now, of course, Australia is a strong advocate for free and open trade and the multilateral system. And, you know, I would say let's keep going through the WTO. But I think there's a lot we can do in stepping up our global leadership to really have this nuanced discussion around repurposing of subsidies and how we can use examples from Australia to show what can be achieved. Now, I said I'd come back to the EU and the Green Deal. So for someone who's got a regulatory reform background, this was one of the finest examples of how not to do good policy. And yet in Australia, we've actually got a long history and a really good history of best practice regulation making and good frameworks. It goes to consultation, it goes to co-design, it goes to examining all the policy options, cost-benefit analysis, the impact on business, but most importantly, don't come up with the solution until you've actually worked out what the problem is. And so a caution, I think, to all of us. I'm actually seeing a slippage in that, in regulation making here in Australia. If we're actually going to be grasping what we need to do in terms of standards and credentials and regulations that get put into place, particularly when it comes to global standards, we need to make sure that we're adhering to evidence and science-based decision making. We need to make sure that we have robust analysis. We need to make sure that we think about implementation, so that's where co-design and consultation comes into place, because with all due respect, you cannot design good regulation just sitting at a desk without thinking, how does it work in practice on the ground? So they're all things we need to do. We have the guardrails in place. We just need to follow them. And then finally, I think, look, we've got great credentials. We've heard some really good stories about what we're doing. I still say we tend to talk to ourselves. We speak to audiences who actually know what the answer should be. We've got to get more mainstream. When I see what they do in the EU, why have they been so powerful in terms of the farm to fork? It's the NGOs that have agitated with a lot of money behind them, and they've got their message across, and they've actually got in the minds of consumers what consumers think they need. We've actually got to correct that with the facts, dispel the myths, to make sure that we can continue to trade in a free and open way, and we're actually going to continue to get more money into agriculture, but going to the right outcomes. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Sue. Some really good messages there around repurposing and subsidies, facts, dispelling myths, evidence-based, data-driven, and I particularly like the ones about demonstrating, improving what we claim. Some really good insights there. And I always like someone besides me talking negative about the EU. So, turning to our next panellist, Sarah, for the industry perspective. Australia has strong sustainability credentials, but we need to be proactive to maintain our competitiveness in a fast evolving landscape. What's your view from the grain sector?
Great question. Thank you very much. To, I suppose, continue with Sue's message around our sustainability credentials, that is the purpose of the Grain Sustainability Framework and all the sector sustainability frameworks in Australia, of which we have a number now. And it was actually Lord Kelvin, not KPMG, who said, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So Kelvin, as in, yes, Kelvinator fridges, which you might have owned one at some point in your life. So the frameworks are very much about that. The frameworks are Australia's report card, and it's our report card that we present annually. Excuse me. And I like to think of each of our report cards as representing a multi-billion-dollar business. So if you had a $20 to $25 billion business, like, I don't know, the Australian grain sector, then it would be a fairly compelling set of evidence to suggest that, you know, given current political and business expectations, that you should be disclosing things about your business in order to facilitate trade, but also for a lot of other reasons. So we report annually across our frameworks, and we do it transparently. And that's a very important part of any framework or sector framework reporting MO. And we do this for ourselves, but also for trade, so we can showcase our strengths, so the areas that we're working very well in. We can also identify areas for improvement. And then we have a fantastic, compelling set of evidence to put on the table improvements that we need to make in Australian agriculture and how they might be addressed through our public organisations, through funding. And it's not necessarily high tech. So there's, you know, like most things in life, they work on a continuum. So there can be improvements we can make in our agricultural practices. Everything from, I don't know, have a hazard analysis on your property, on your enterprise. Maybe don't store your chemicals next to the tractor, all the way through to high-end, genetic modification and looking at breeding programs around more drought-resilient grain strains, for example. And, you know, on that other end, when we're talking about safety, on-farm safety, we don't have a great record in that area. Let's be frank. We kill, on average, over the last 20 years, the numbers show, on average, our industry has about 80 on-farm fatalities per year. Now, that over-indexes by about 7 times from any other dangerous sector, and it's very similar for serious injuries as well. So, you know, understanding our environmental impact and our economic value is extremely important, but none of this is possible without a healthy, capable workforce. So that's an example of, you know, the transparency in our reporting, as my ex-colleague Pip Band used to say, who set up the beef framework. We show the good, the bad and the very ugly. Now, why is that a good thing? That can also be rather frightening too, can't it? Coming to the table with some numbers that we don't think are fantastic and we know are not fantastic. But as I said, that informs changes that we make. Now, if you're transparent and, if you read is it Brené Brown? Vulnerable, what that does is build trust. So trust is something that everybody wants with their customers, with their trading partners, with their communities. And trust is a critical part of establishing trade. Now, with transparency being a way to establish trust, we know then that consumers, customers, trading partners, particularly customers, don't expect you to be perfect, but they do expect you not to bullshit them. And that is a very important part of the power of the sustainability frameworks. And if you catch me later, I can tell you a few stories about not very good results that have actually ended in quite good outcomes. So trade. Trust leads to trade. And when you're talking about trade, you're talking about a cross-border supply chain. And so when we're talking about things like that, of course, we need to report from a global trade point of view to meet to comply with a lot of their local laws. And yes, we talked about the EU. Some of the laws and requirements can be quite inflexible. Is that a good way? And stringent, pretty tight. But there's other ones like, the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, which I would find hard to argue with the parts about human rights. the human rights requirements that they require you to report about if you want to do trade with them, or freedom of association. So that, there are lots of things that make a sustainable sector. As I often say, a good CO2e number does not a sustainability framework make. You can quote me on that. It's a long quote. There are many, many things. And of course, we want to demonstrate our ethics as an Australian production nation around agriculture and our values, and also we want to mitigate any reputational risk that we might have. So frameworks are good for transparency, they're good for trust, they're good for trade. So ultimately, they're very good for our agricultural sectors. And that means that we don't do one report and file it in the Z drive. What that report does then is track our progress over time, because this I can tell you for sure. One data point is, yes, one data point. 2 data points, that's a straight line. It's not until the 3rd or 4th point that we can start looking at trends, and that is the potency of our sector frameworks, is seeing how we're progressing over time. And underpinning that, because most of our frameworks are owned by growers or producers, is that we have excellent stakeholder engagement all across the value chain, and that we're informed by very robust materiality studies that we do a bit like the Olympics about every 4 years to identify what is it that we really need to make sure that we can report and work on like a boss to minimise our risk and can complete our trade requirements for this particular sector. And, the good old chestnut, it's so important, defensible data. And that's the word I use. Just any data that we report needs to be of a very high quality and completely defensible. If any of us are in a situation like this with microphones, maybe, I don't know, up the road a bit, in a different building, if you're feeling me there. Yes, I would also echo Fennessy this morning. Adam Fennessy talked about his sharp elbows, which I really liked, and that is also one of the important outcomes of the frameworks, is that they operate with sharp elbows so that we can agitate, we can get things on the menu for improvements for our international trade. I think I might leave it there.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. And I've just turned my phone off.
Thanks.
With that comment about someone near to us.
Oh, yeah.
Look, I think that was really interesting. We hear that the industry has in achieving sustainability frameworks in a low subsidy environment, but importantly doing it in a way that actually industry itself owns and developing. Particularly the question of trust and defensible data is really, really important. Transparency is something as a public servant we're scared of, but it actually is good. It's just those first 2 or 3 years that you get nervous, but by the end of it, it strengthens everything. So it is something that we shouldn't be scared of, and we should, as a sector, think more and more about how we pick up that question of transparency and trust. But it is also important to hear from an international perspective, because I think Sue mentioned we just talk to ourselves all the time. And so it is important to hear from an international perspective in all this. So I'll turn to you, Azizah. How is Indonesia working to meet its climate change, food security and development goals through agriculture?
Thank you. I have some slides. Yes, so story time on Indonesia. I'll start with the Golden Indonesia 2045, or what we call Indonesia Emas. It's a set of ambitious visions established by the National Planning Agency in the long-term development plan, as you can see on the right side of the slide. Out of the 5 main targets, here I have 3 that I think are most relevant to our discussions today. The first target is to achieve income per capita equivalent to that of developed nations. Second is to reduce poverty and to reduce inequality. 5th is to achieve net zero emissions. To achieve these, there needs to be a very serious transformation especially in the Indonesia's agricultural sector, as there are currently more than 48% of the heads of poor households in Indonesia who are engaged in the sector. And these targets should also be considered as part of these strategies in achieving food security, especially since Indonesia also has the medium-term development plan on the left side, where Indonesia aspires to increase its global food security index to 95.2, while in 2022, the overall score was just 60.2. And in the past couple of months, maybe some of you have heard that Indonesians have been challenged by the rising price of rice, our staple food. It has reached its all-time high recently. With all the challenges, it would be, I would say, impossible to achieve all these ambitious targets without a major transformation in the agricultural sector. Next slide, please. Now, no, the previous one? Yeah, this one. Now, I know how much the audience here loves graphs, but I don't have that today. I instead have paddy fields and water hyacinth stem. Thank you for you guys to look at. So now let's take a step back and examine the current situations that we are facing in Indonesia. Have the targets been reflected in the government strategies? Short answer would be no. So in recent years, government subsidies and assistance have focused on improving productivity. Sue mentioned that subsidies in developing countries may be more towards achieving poverty, eliminating poverty, and then improve livelihood, which is maybe true. But fertilizer subsidy in Indonesia is market distortive. And it's given indirectly to the fertilizer manufacturers, which then would sell the fertilizer to farmers at a reduced price. Between 2003 to 2020, the Indonesian government have spent around $22 billion on fertilizer and seed subsidies. And then from January to November 2023, fertilizer subsidies contributed the second largest share of non-energy subsidy budget realization in Indonesia. Indonesia's OECD producer support estimate in 2020 was 6.28% relative to gross farm receipt. From quickly scanning through Australia's data, I believe this is Australia back in the 90s. To quote Dr. Greenfield on his keynote today, Australia's producer support in 2020 was at around 4%. However, spending these amount of money on inputs does not appear to have any impact on agricultural output. And on top of that, farmers are struggling. They are constantly struggling with getting the fertilizer itself. There are lots of issues on scarcity, forcing them to use less fertilizer than it is actually required, which has like a very strong impact to their productivity. Furthermore, there's also been a change of policy. As of 2023, the Indonesian government stopped the subsidies for organic fertilizer and only subsidizing two types, which is urea and NPK, both synthetic fertilizers. While urea, for example, is popular everywhere, there's also studies that overuse of urea could be damaging to the environment. Now, remember the net zero goal? Indonesia is currently expanding thousands of hectares of lands, including forest lands, under what is called the Food Estate, which is a national government priority program. And to quote Dr. Marion Jansen from OECD, this morning, more lands means bad news for GHG emissions. And also, in 2022, the agricultural sector itself already contributed to 13% of the greenhouse gases emissions, while AFOLU represented around 56%. Like anywhere else, farmers are also aging. And at the moment, we only have around 8% of farmers below 40 years old in Indonesia. That's very low, which makes the technology penetration in the sector even more harder. And these are the challenges, basically, why Indonesia cannot go with the business as usual scenarios. Indonesia needs to modernize its agricultural sector. Indonesia needs to also have a stronger commitment to achieve the targets that I showed you earlier. Next slide, please. Sorry.
Talking to
Sorry.
yourself. Yeah.
All right, sorry. So modernizing Indonesia's agriculture, leaving unsustainable practices that have been going on for decades, as well as reforming current market distortive agricultural policies are a way forward. From our research, to modernize, Indonesia first needs to redirect agricultural assistance in forms of goods to direct cash paid directly to farmers, which will improve farmers' access to quality inputs. Farmers will also have more options and hopefully close the price gap existing now between non-subsidized fertilizers and the subsidized ones, the artificially low-priced subsidized ones. Also, James mentioned earlier that removing subsidies and tariffs means removing unnecessary produce, and I also agree with that. Second, Indonesia needs to promote intensification instead of land expansion. So the food as state approach, repeatedly implemented to serve food sovereignty instead of food security targets, has failed repeatedly, and instead Indonesia should promote on agriculture intensification using quality seeds, fertilizers, technology, and also good agricultural practices. Next, Indonesia needs to promote private sector's investment in agriculture outside the palm oil, because that's actually like the biggest investment in Indonesia, in agriculture in Indonesia right now. It has shown from our studies that there have been successful partnerships between farmers and private sectors in dairy farms that can helped improve the quality of milk, improve the livelihood of farmers, also technology transfer. Last but not least is to advance agriculture extension services, meaning that government needs to commit to programs that can focus on knowledge sharing, training that can result in long-lasting result. I guess that's everything from Indonesia. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. It is good to hear how Indonesia, one of our nearest neighbours and a growing economy, is actually looking to modernise its ag sector. Interesting enough, Indonesian officials are out here this week looking to think about how they can use some of Australia's IP to actually boost agricultural production within Indonesia. So, time for questions. We have any questions in the room. There is one burning one that's come up here for me as a regulator. I'd be really, really keen for Sue to answer for me. Could you please elaborate upon the areas where you think we are losing our way on reg reform in Australian agriculture?
So I think we're losing it in a number of ways. I think we've reverted back to what comes from the hill, so a political response where you just have the solution without thinking what the problem is. And that is where a constituency or a member may put this, to an MP who then says to their department, we need to introduce a regulation to do this. So the department goes away and dutifully obeys what the minister says and drafts the regulation without actually saying, do we really need this regulation in the first place? I think we've fallen back on open consultation and co-design, particularly co-design. And by co-design, I mean the use of sandboxes, pilots to actually say, how will this work in practice? And that is part of good, really good best practice regulation making. So you actually get to test this. The consideration of different policy options. I think we've reduced the number, and one of them should always be do nothing. Do we actually really need this regulation? Is that really going to be the answer? And all of these are just really what I regard as being basic steps in good regulation making. What I've been seeing, and look, this ends up being a process for bureaucrats, and it never should be, is I'm not seeing a lot of regulation impact statements that really are doing the proper analysis, and they've gone back to being a tick and flick rather than let's think about this early in the policy making process, because in the end we're going to get better policy. So sorry, that was a bit of a technical answer. But, you know, having been someone who was part of developing best practice regulation and the framework, there's nothing wrong with sticking to it.
Yeah, fair point. As one of those ones who does those regulations you just talked about. But that's okay. Any questions from the floor? Sue, down here, can we scoot a microphone across?
It's like an obstacle course.
Sue Ogilvie, Program Director for Farming for the Future. So, given the conversation, this has been a great panel, very entertaining, thank you very much. The conversation is about changing global conversation, and we've had a little bit of conversation about that already today. I had the privilege of being at COP28, hearing about a number of the global conversations, the Declaration on Regenerative Landscapes and those sort of things. It seems to me that Australia has a tremendous opportunity to use those sort of forums for those sort of global conversations as well. I wondered if any of the panel would like to speak about that.
Perhaps James, and then Sue was at COP28.
I think Sue's well placed to talk about this. I'll just provide kind of my 2 cents worth. I hesitated a little bit with, you know, the whole idea of this panel because, you know, I'm not saying you're all converted, but it's a bit like preaching to the converted. And Sue touched on this. You know, why would you go to Australia to talk about the benefits of lower agricultural support? It's important to bear in mind that, you know, an Australian audience isn't the only audience that we speak to. You know, there's the department has its global agriculture, the councillor network around the world. And, you know, one core part of their job is that advocacy kind of thing. So, you know, they go around the world. You know, on the kind of the research front and the ideas dissemination front, so my team takes part in a lot of presentations internationally as well. Thank goodness for, you know, online Zoom things these days. That makes life a lot easier. So, you know, we are here talking to an Australian audience, but I think it's important to keep an Australian audience updated kind of on activities that we do. But, you know, it is very important to put that to international forums like COP28, but also in, you know, other international forums like recent ones I've been involved in, been at OECD, other ones been at, you know, some smaller commodity organisations like the International Grains Council as well. But I'll hand over to Sue.
Thank you. Look, that's a great question. And you were at COP28, I was at COP28. It was a marvellous opportunity to be able to be there on a global stage, to be able to articulate what we're doing in Australian agriculture, to share what we're doing and also hear from others and to build networks. We can do so much more in that space. So I think being much more early prepared, taking very much a Team Australia approach to involve government, industry, other parts of the private sector, coming together to actually say we speak for Australia and we speak across all different areas and different aspects of what we can bring. I think that's going to be really powerful, and that's something that I've provided feedback on, particularly in the lead up to COP31, which Australia has made a bid for. So for me, it's what does success look like at COP31 for Australian agriculture and how do we build to that? I think the other thing we need to do that came through to me from COP28 was we've actually got to get governments really understanding the important and critical role of agriculture to climate challenges. Yes, there's a focus on energy now and there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there, but if we don't act now, We can't rest on our laurels, because in another few years' time, then we'll be saying, okay, we've done what we need to do around energy. Who else is there? Well, let's look at agriculture. And yes, we've got the sector plans, but everyone's got to be there saying, all right, what do we do around the sustainability frameworks? And the AASF for me, that's the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework, is a great thing for me to put up in global markets, because we're the only country who's got anything like it. But we've got to now go to the next level and make sure we've got the right calculators, the right tools, the right measurements, so we can report and clearly demonstrate and substantiate what we're doing, because that's how we'll be judged in the future.
There are also other opportunities which APEC, FAO, WTO, just to name a few, and there's no global standards anybody for sustainability. So to Sue's point, we have to take those opportunities and be out there much more on the front foot about how we actually think about the message we have in Australia. That is a really strong, powerful message. And to James' point, we do have councillors overseas, but as an ex-councillor, you can't just keep harping on, oh, well, here's an ABARES report. They soon close the door on you. It's actually about how you actually turn it into a conversation to how it works for them, what it means for them, how you personalise it. And if we do get COP31, it'll be a fantastic opportunity. You know, there was, 75,000 people, maybe more. You know, it may take a Taylor Swift concert look empty. Yeah, it's a fantastic opportunity for us to showcase how we go forward. So should that play out for us as a sector, it's a fantastic opportunity as I stand here and preach. So I do apologise. I might go to the screen if that's okay, and we'll come back to the in-room audience. So, Azir, you actually have a question, which is, intensification can also lead to poor environmental outcomes, especially with price controls on agricultural products. How can this trade-off be managed? Because it is something we as a country had to manage back in the 80s.
Thank you so much for the question. Actually, it's a bit tricky, I would say, to answer the question. So agricultural products, price controls is also a thing in Indonesia. It's one of the most common policy instrument that the government uses. What I would like to highlight is that maybe it's important to reiterate that price controls don't work usually, especially in the experience of Indonesia, as we can see from the current rice price crisis. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. Maybe James, you want to add something? Sure.
Yeah, I wanted to answer that question in a very broad sense. If you look at what's happened in Australian agriculture, you know, since I think it's about 1960 or 1970, agricultural land use has come down, but you know, agricultural production significantly gone up. We also see that, so that basically is a form of intensification. We've also got to think about the commodity mix that we're producing there. But you know, you can have better environmental outcomes if you have a look at what's happened since 1990 to now. And it would be convenient if we were kind of 1 or 2 years earlier, because if you look at the data up to, I think it's up to 2020, out of the top developed country big agricultural producers, we actually had the biggest fall in agricultural emissions over 30 years. We've now been pipped by the EU just with 1 extra year of data. But you know, that also highlights a whole lot of things about policy change, and you know, again, about policies that essentially, these interventions in markets that mess with people's incentives, and they do end up with more emissions. So the big policy change that happened was actually, would you believe it, the Wool Reserve Price Scheme. And so that's why since 1990 the emissions have come down. And it just shows that policy, ag support, Wool Reserve Price Scheme does tie into emissions. But I just wanted to link that to that. You know, you can get more with less and have better environmental outcomes.
Someone went to university when we were debating whether we should maintain the reserve price scheme. It does bring back memories. So thanks, James and Azir. Any questions from the floor? The lights are a bit bright. If not, there's one here. Sarah, you've been involved in a couple of sustainability frameworks now. How are they change in practice at the producer level, scale?
Are they changing practice, or is there evidence of practice
Are
change?
they driving positive practices,
Yeah.
practice change?
In some cases, yes, they are, for the reasons often to do with the frightening figures that have come from transparent reporting. So I would say things like pain management, particularly for livestock, through painful animal husbandry procedures. There was precious little national data about that kind of thing, and just the fact that we had the framework meant that we had to find the resources to get good defensible data around it, and the insights. Because typically when we obtain this data, it's nice to say, well, what do you do a particular procedure and do you use pain management and which one is it, yada, yada, yada. And it's also important to understand the reasons why they use that particular one or don't use any at all. And, it's one of those sort of topics of conversation. Everyone thinks they know the answer, but of course no one's ever got any numbers to prove it or otherwise. And so we've learnt things like, well, I thought it was the right pain management and it wasn't. So that means that there's a whole push then around changing behaviour that's not that hard to change. So if you're already interested in pain management for your livestock, getting you to suddenly use a different one, which will actually have a pain management effect, is not that hard. So, that's one of the areas where we can see improvement. But, it's only as good as the sharpness of the elbows, I suppose, that are used after the data comes out. But yeah, it's one of the things that can be used to drive practice change. But as we know, it's any kind of behaviour change can be a complicated thing for us humans.
Yeah, and takes time.
Indeed.
Sue?
Look, I might just add that sustainability frameworks are fantastic because they set the scene and they set the overarching objectives. In the end, if you actually want to get practice change, there's got to be a value proposition for the farmers who are going to be putting this in place. You will always have those early leaders that will be the ones that will probably be able to get a bit of a premium or be able to get that market access, but you need to bring the others with you. And so it's thinking about what are the policy levers or processes that you need to put in place to make sure, and this is critical when it comes to meeting the climate challenges, that we are bringing most of agriculture with us. For some of those real laggards, will they end up just not remaining in the industry? But we want to bring them with us. Otherwise, we're going to have what we saw earlier with the plant, the CSIRO and the biosecurity plan. Was it that? No, it was the earlier session where there were 4 scenarios. And those 4 scenarios, we will end up having too many people who have not moved along, and we actually want to get most people in the we're on the trajectory to where we need to get to.
There's a question here.
Hi, Trent Swift, 24 Nuffield Scholar. Question around post-COVID. I'm a producer. Just around subsidies, we being able to access JobKeeper. And has there been any thoughts around that as a subsidy in terms of productivity? We didn't have to bring a whole new workforce in at key periods, especially with sowing and things. Just a general conversation and thoughts.
That's the question for government.
It is, and so as a true official, I delegate it to James.
There's one thing that, believe it or not, I'm going to start with the Treaty of Rome.
What time is it?
So, the Treaty of Rome, it's the founding document of the, I believe, the European community. And one of the clauses in that is something to do with guaranteeing basically a reasonable income for agricultural producers. What astounds me is the attempts to do this through agricultural subsidies. I mean, you can do this through the welfare system and standard, income payments. Well, in Australia we would just call it Centrelink. And that's not any kind of distortionary support. In terms of, COVID payments, and for labour markets, if it's some kind of whole of economy thing, it's it all gets a bit more difficult. Is this some kind of essentially a subsidy for labour force hire for a particular sector? Depends how it's structured. I don't think that one was, you couldn't call that out as some kind of like ag subsidy. But I just think it's important to think about that you don't have to have some kind of, well, it's all about the repurposing, isn't it? I might leave it there. It's one that requires a bit more thought.
It is.
But I did want to provide that comment that, a whole lot of this ag support, for example, can be provided through the welfare system. So you repurpose it, so it's an income transfer to people.
Or through the tax system.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I might even posit the argument, are we post-COVID? There are many data sets that would suggest that we in fact are not. And I'm pretty sure that it won't be our last pandemic or zoonotic disease. Just cheery, kind of upbeat finish there.
Well, so the last session we had the spot walk down the steps. This session, our closure is we're still in the middle of a pandemic. But look, we are at times. So in all seriousness, I'd like to thank everyone. What we have heard today is food security development, sustainability, economic development, not competing goals. We need to work out how we work with these things together, how we actually use the mechanisms we've got. Repurposing, transparency, trust, verifiable data, evidence-based came up really, really strongly. And it probably is a theme that's gone through how we actually do much of what we want to do. That does help us internationally in a trade context of how we actually drive a trade agenda to actually maximise Australia's value, but also how we actually reform some of these trade distorting subsidies and repurpose them. And I think the Indonesian experience, as they're starting to go through where we were many years ago, is a really fascinating area. And I think we as a sector probably have a lot to learn by working with Indonesia rather than just watching. And I think it's something that we can think about a much more joined up approach with the path they're going, modernising their system and what we can learn from that. So overall, I think it was a really powerful discussion around a low subsidy environment. No buses, which is really good. And so I'd like to join me in thanking the panel for everything, for this conversation today. And just one final plug for the CAB, Catalysing Australia's Biosecurity, in the Sundown in the courtyard up there, where Andy promises that someone will make spot dance for you. Thank you, everyone.